The team at Murkoff have been hard at work recruiting new prime assets for their trials at the Sinjala facility, and in this video we'll be breaking down each prime asset released so far and all of the details that we have on their backgrounds and history. But before we begin, it's important to remember the key points in which a prime asset are chosen by Murkoff for their role within the Sinjala facility. Easterman is specifically looking for individuals with extreme amounts of charisma, believing charisma to be a weapon that can be sculpted, since no organ in the human body is more vulnerable to sculpt than the brain. This is the entire purpose of a prime asset, to create widespread societal change. Easterman actually uses Hitler as an example of this, describing him as a small, unattractive and unassuming man until he started speaking. They want somebody that you can drop into a crowd of completely sane people, and within minutes, could be a crowd of lunatics. Each and every single prime asset needs to share that charismatic character attribute. So with that context in mind, let's begin with Leland Coyle. Born in Blackwell, Oklahoma in 1923, Leland Coyle didn't have the greatest childhood. During a background check on Coyle by Murkoff, they come to find out that there was actually evidence that he abused animals and was actually SA'd as a child. This would lead him to have an early education in the military academy, but his violent and criminal tendencies continued. And during his teenage years, Coyle would actually go on to join the KKK and marry his first wife at the age of 19. Now, Leland's marriage was very short-lived. Only 6 months later, his wife would die from falling down the stairs. Of course, a death like that can create some heat, so Coyle would go on to join the US Marine Corps to avoid any investigation for the death of his first wife. Surprisingly, Leland Coyle was actually a very good soldier, serving in the Pacific Theater with honors during World War II and taking part in the Battle of Okinawa, which was considered the bloodiest battle in the Pacific Theater during World War II. By the end of the war, he would have 3 confirmed kills and 2 suspicious American deaths within his company. He would then return to Oklahoma after the war, returning to his role within the KKK, soon becoming a police officer a few years later in 1947. It shouldn't come as a surprise that an individual like Coyle would have an inflated feeling of his own self-worth, obsessively keeping notes that point to how vital he is to history and his great interest in posterity. This leads him to be described as an extremely effective policeman, creating enormous profits from exploitations of prison labor, extortion, and civil forfeiture. You know, the good stuff. The police department would give him multiple commendations, including Officer of the Year and a Policeman's Benevolence Association Award for Community Excellence. Nothing says community excellence like extortion and exploiting free labor. After the great success of his first marriage, it's only right that he would go on to marry again, putting his skills to good use and extorting his second wife's family. This family, by the way, would go on to conveniently die in an electrical fire. Understandably, his wife would flee to Chicago out of fear and would then die of natural causes. Her body was found by some Easter egg hunt participants. I'm sure that's not what the Easter Bunny was intending on hiding. It's also noted that Coyle was standing in a field watching lightning storms on 5 separate occasions during his surveillance. I'm sure he's just taking in the beauty of lightning storms, right? Surely it can't be anything weird. Coyle would be promoted to sergeant, while his third wife also dies of self-inflicted, multiple gunshot wounds to the head. Now, I will state that again. Multiple gunshot wounds to the head. It's impressive that she was able to pull the trigger more than once. Doesn't sound suspicious in the slightest. Oh, and by the way, the third wife's entire family also dies within a year of her death. All are ruled as self-inflicted, and their chosen methods progressively got more violent and convoluted methodologies. What are the chances? Despite all of this, Coyle is still beloved within the police force, even holding a high standing in the Elks Club and the VFW. Now, it shouldn't come as a surprise that a man like Leland Coyle would garner the eye of Murkoff. See, in 1956, Clyde Perry would organize a meeting with Coyle at a bar on Route 177, under the pretense of bribery. Coyle was well liked by the bar staff and the customers, and he made out Perry within minutes, telling Perry that he noticed that he was being followed for days now. And to say that this took a violent turn would be an understatement. Perry described it as being a crippled mouse used as a plaything by a tomcat, pointing out the fact that if Coyle actually wanted to kill him, well, he wouldn't be writing this report right now. He would sustain 2 broken fingers, a hell of a lot of bruising, and he began peeing blood, causing him to take some well-needed rest out in Wichita. Despite this, Coyle's charisma is undeniable, and quickly recommends him as a prime asset for Project Lathe. The reagents would encounter Coyle within the police station and courthouse trials, with his belief of upholding the law with maximum force only being more exaggerated with time, dispensing his own personal brutal form of justice whenever he can. See, it's mentioned in an early interview between Murkoff and Coyle where he mentions how he doesn't actually care about control, he just wants authority. Can you have authority over yourself without control? It's also incredibly clear that Coyle's interest in electricity goes far beyond its beauty. Let's just say that his love of his shock baton would make masochists blush, and he is quite adept at using it. In 1960, there was a heavy ex-pop called Henrietta Grubbs, otherwise known as the Jaeger. See, she was a reagent that was tested upon by Murkoff, and created to be an incredibly strong and menacing foe for anybody that may have stumbled across her in the trials. Normally, a prime asset's presence within a trial would create complete control over the ex-population due to their innate charismatic qualities. This was however not the case for Henrietta, as she would actually attack her prime asset. The prime asset that she decided to attack was Leland Coyle. This is obviously an incredibly rare occurrence that realistically shouldn't even happen, and the Jaeger is considerably larger than Leland Coyle and would pose a serious physical threat to him. Not to mention, Henrietta was the product of extensive testing and experimentation by Murkoff, giving her hormone baths and bone extension surgeries to increase her strength, creating a huge weapon, so to speak. However, despite all of this, Coyle would actually go on to inflict fatal injuries to Henrietta. The Murkoff team would presume her dead from her injuries and throw her down the biohazard disposal shuttle. She did manage to survive, however, but the injuries sustained by Coyle were extensive. Now let's move on to the other of the two original prime assets. Born in Philadelphia to dentist Dr. A. Futterman, Phyllis had nobody in her life except her father. It's noted that her mother was out of the picture and she worked from a young age with her father in the dental business, acting as her father's assistant, using puppets to keep children patients calm during drilling and surgery. She also had a keen interest in taxidermy and musical theatre. These traits would make her the perfect choice for a locally broadcasted television program in 1951 called the Mother Gooseberry Hour. She would star in the show with her father until his death. However, after Dr. Futterman's death, the show would take a turn for the darker side. See, Phyllis did not take the death of her father very well, developing what seems to be DID, or dissociative identity disorder, which contributed to the tone shift for the Mother Gooseberry Hour. However, I should note, I have read many discussions on this, and some from people with actual degrees in psychology, so much smarter than myself. They point to the fact that it's actually not DID that she's actually suffering from, but rather OSDD, which is other specified dissociative disorder, since apparently DID patients have lapses in concentration and memory, which she doesn't. It's even mentioned that she could have OCD with delusion, but it's actually not acutely mentioned. She begins conditioning her adolescent audience through classical applications of abuse, praise, and narcotics, using her mail-order dental drops to hook a whole generation of children on narcotics, violence, theft, and in some cases even murder. Well, there goes her potential house on Sesame Street. By 1955, the police would conduct a raid on the television studio, creating this absolute horror show, looking to arrest Phyllis on kidnapping and racketeering charges. However, Phyllis had retreated into the puppetry tunnels that she had created underneath her set, proceeding to kill 2 police officers and injuring 5 with her drill before being arrested. The police chief described the Futterland Studios as the most grotesque architectural perversion since H.H. Holmes' Chicago murder castle. That means that there were a bunch of fake walls, trapdoors, and all kinds of nasty surprises that awaited those police officers. Phyllis would be sent to Holmesburg Prison in North Philadelphia on a life sentence. Now, this next part is actually based on a real doctor and a real situation that happened at Holmesburg Prison. See, there was a doctor by the name of Dr. Kliegman who conducted dermatological experiments on inmates. This caused Phyllis to be almost unrecognizable compared to the archived photos and mugshot that she had done when she arrived at the prison. She was exposed to carbonic acid, dioxin, and grafts of infected corpse flesh. Now, I don't know about the first two, but I sure as hell know that infected corpse flesh is not on the standard skin beauty routine. It was described by Clyde Perry, as he was looking into Phyllis's case on behalf of Murkoff, that the other patients actually got it worse, if you could believe it. Not only that, but Futterman's physical health actually remains remarkable, even if she does look like yesterday's guacamole. Clyde would conduct an interview with Phyllis, noting her multiple personalities. Her first personality was that of her normal self, Phyllis Futterman, while simultaneously switching to her on-screen persona of Mother Gooseberry, a more childlike version of Phyllis Futterman, roughly when she was about 14 years old. The second personality was that of her hand puppet. See, she created a duck puppet scavenged from cafeteria and workplace scraps, and would give the puppet the personality of Dr. A. Futterman, her dead father. This personality was abusive and extremely violent, but also oddly charming. Both of these personalities would be subject to periodic lapses into extreme rage, but Perry does note that she shows remarkable charisma. Not only was she able to turn a bunch of innocent kids into absolute terrors to society, but she managed to have physical relations with 2 different guards, despite her ragged appearance after these experiments. Many other inmates and staff have also fallen very charismatic way. Perry would go on to highly recommend Phyllis Futterman, aka Mother Gooseberry, as a candidate for the prime asset within the Lathe program. Reagents will run into Phyllis within the orphanage, fun park and toy factory programs, where she puts her drill puppet to very terrifying use. Now, a few things are important to note. The personality that she displays with Dr. A. Futterman, being abusive and incredibly violent, does not suggest very good things when you take into account that that personality is based around her dead father. I will also point out during the Toy Factory program that there are numerous dolls found within it that have been drawn on by Phyllis, and let's just say that it is very lewd, things I can't even mention on YouTube. But it's also a worrying sign when you take into account that the innocence she portrays with her Mother Gooseberry persona. There are moments in particular voice lines between Futterman and her puppet where she alludes to the fact that her father's death could have actually been a result of usage of benzodrine and gin, which is a pretty nasty combo, and likely contributed to his demise. Now we move on to the real man-child of the bunch. Franco Barbi is the son of Louisiana Mafia Don Salvatore Barbi, also known on the street as Figo Barbi or Sally Figs. Franco never met his actual birth mother, instead growing up around his father's numerous wives and of course partaking in the criminal underworld that befits the son of a Mafia Don. He wasted no time getting himself into the same violent life that his father lived, having committed his very first murder at the young age of 12. Killing a man that owed his father money and using his old man's shotgun to do it. It is described by a friend of Salvatore's as being the very first time his father ever hugged or acted proud of Franco in any way. This of course would only be the first of many murders. Only a few years later, in Franco's teenage years, he would go on to become his father's triggerman and hitman, sawing off the same shotgun and using it as his primary tool of murder. This very shotgun would earn Franco the nickname of Lupara, or Lupa by many. Lupara is an Italian word to refer to a sawn-off shotgun, and boy does he put it to good use. Franco would essentially go on a murder spree, and there wasn't a month that would pass where the Mafia family wouldn't hear about another person winding up dead, shot to pieces and resembling a chewed-up dog toy. Franco would kill for little to no reason, and it didn't take long before the cops were involved, and even his powerful father couldn't keep them at bay. Franco would end up being exiled to Miami by his father. But there are conflicting reasons as to why this happened. Firstly, some believe it was due to the growing police interest in the Martino crime family due to Franco's murders, opting to send him away to let everything cool off. The other reason given is a bit more spicy, however. See, Franco is not much of a looker, and that's putting it lightly, so he would frequent the services of working girls, even killing some of them. A rumour went around that old Franco had trouble, well, getting it up. That is until a secret fling with one particular woman. See, Salvatore, Franco's father, was no stranger to wives. In fact, he had a total of 4 during Franco's upbringing. But it wasn't until Salvatore's 4th marriage to Angelina Barbi where things got a little weird. Franco and his stepmother Angelina had a secret love affair, and when Salvatore found out, it did not end well for old Franco, being beaten within an inch of his life and his cranial birth defects now being expanded upon by his physical trauma. And if you want to go by this story, Franco was exiled to Miami as punishment from his father. His actions while in Miami didn't change all that much, becoming an assassin for hire and a debt collector. There is even good reason to believe that the murders carried out by Franco are psychosexual in nature. It is said that Franco would collect the nipples of his victims. Ugh. Franco would also spend his time in Cuba, and for a brief amount of time was utilized by the CIA on missions, being sent out on CIA-led raids against Cuban revolutionary forces. But Franco is Franco, and having specific targets is boring. He would go on to murder just about anybody without any real thought. This of course was not ideal for the CIA, and they would eventually have to set him loose. His time in Cuba did not come to an end here, however, with Franco actually witnessing a Murkoff reagent conducting a murder. This would lead him to murder 7 people during the chaos that the reagent started. This of course caught the eye of Murkoff, who was observing the reagent at work, and would go on to send Clyde Perry to investigate this mysterious man that people were calling Lupara. Clyde would track Franco down to a rundown hotel, where he was in a room with a working girl. Only Franco had killed the woman and climbed inside her corpse like a baby. Not the only baby-like reference to this character, which I'll get to in a second. A fight ensues between Franco and Clyde, which ends with Clyde needing leg reconstruction and skull surgery before Franco would eventually be picked up by Murkoff and transported to the Sinyala facility to act as their third prime asset. Now, I mentioned before the parallels between Franco and a baby. Well, I think I actually now know why. In a recent AMA, Red Barrels answered some questions from the public. In one of the questions, it mentions that Franco was actually inspired to be a mix between his 2 predecessors, Coyle and Gooseberry. See, Gooseberry is the mother and Coyle is the father, figuratively speaking of course, but Franco would fit in as the child. Now we can see that Franco enjoys his role as child a little too much. Of course, the moment he crawled into the stomach of the woman like a fetus, only to burst out like a worse version of Chucky. His necklace of choice is a pacifier that he keeps around his neck at all times. But we can even see within the trial that Franco opts to cradle himself into the arms of some of the ex-population, acting as a child, and in some cases even breastfeeding himself. Not to mention that he collects nipples, and while I cannot show this on YouTube for obvious reasons, he literally has a factory in the dock that he collects breast milk from numerous reagents for his personal collection. And using baby milk bottles, except the lids have been replaced with cut-off nipples. Coyle and Gooseberry honestly seem not that bad in comparison to this creepy man-child. Franco is permitted by Murkoff to keep his iconic shotgun within the trials using bone fragments and teeth as ammunition instead of your typical bullets. His dock environment is of course decked out like a typical mafia-run casino with a giant boat sporting the name of Angelina, just like his stepmother and short-lived love interest. Not to mention that his environment is also a fully functioning heroin facility that the reagents use to make a little extra profit on the side for Murkoff. Before we move on to the next prime asset, I want to bring up how these previous 3 prime assets feel about one another, since we have voice lines available between these 3 in particular. Firstly, Leland Coyle and Mother Gooseberry. Coyle describes Gooseberry as a walking thundercloud, provocative and extremely hysterical, in need of a firm disciplining hand. Wowee. He points out that she looks like a bunch of children who decided to play dress up with a corpse that spent 2 weeks in the river, and again points out that he doesn't actually like her aggressive persona, saying that it's actually one of the many reasons he killed his 3 wives, stating that it should be illegal for a woman to be so provocative, and that just because he's aroused doesn't mean he approves. Oh god. Gooseberry, on the other hand, is not a fan of a police officer being in the trials, with her Futterman persona pointing out just how much of a disaster it was when they last had cops called on them. She also shows signs of interest in Coyle, having conversations about her personas, about wanting to adjust her face and fidgeting with her clothes when Coyle was around. The Futterman persona, on the other hand, despises Coyle, believing that he has his eyes out for his daughter, and mentions that if he sees Coyle make a move towards Gooseberry, he will drill a hole through her neck. Now for Barbi and Coyle. There is a special hatred between these two. Franco despises police officers, and he does not hold back on Coyle, saying that Coyle has something coming for him if he thinks that he can create laws here within the trials. Coyle, however, is more jealous about the fact that Murkoff gave Franco a gun and didn't allow himself, an actual police officer, to have one. Why do criminals get one but then he's just left helpless? Gooseberry and Barbi, on the other hand, have a very weird relationship. I guess that's what you should expect when you have one person with a serious mother issue along with a person that has serious daddy issues. Franco is definitely interested, if you could say that, with Gooseberry, but is not a big fan of the puppet father persona since he thinks that it's just getting in his way. Gooseberry, on the other hand, points out that she's lonely, and even asks the puppet if she could meet up with Franco alone, much to Dr. Futterman's horror. These two match each other's freak on another level that I can't even believe. One big distinction that I do want to bring up is the fact that Coyle views Gooseberry's puppet as a power tool, like an actual literal tool, and also points out just how crazy Gooseberry is in general. Franco, however, describes the puppet as a protective father, seemingly buying into the persona that Gooseberry is assigning to the puppet, something that I found interesting. Alright, now on to the twisted twins of Buffalo. In 1899, conjoined twins Otto and Arora Kress were born in Buffalo, New York, to the Kress Chemical founder Anton Kress. The very product created at Kress Chemicals would go on to play a pretty critical role in the lives of Otto and Arora. See, Anton would bring these chemicals home, and the exposure that they had to their mother contributed to their very conjoining at birth, killing their mother in the process. Only a few years later after the birth, their father's company, Kress Chemical, would begin having financial trouble as stock prices plummet, largely due to Anton's alcohol problem. During this time, however, the twins would show promise in different fields related to their wealthy father. Otto, for example, from a young age would show an interest in politics, showcasing a wise mind and a sharp tongue, while his sister Arora would follow more closely with her father, possessing a talent in chemistry. As they grew older, they would be shunned by society, viewed as monsters, but the twins had a different way of thinking. I'll read out their rough philosophy. You need to discover your passion, nurture your talents. When you belong in a world that tells you that you're unnatural, you indulge in the pleasures afforded to you. They call you monsters, but you have a method. As much science. It's a matter of art, never odd or even. It's a matter of art. As much as science, but you have a method. They call you monsters. You indulge in the pleasures afforded to you. When the world tells you you're unnatural, nurture your talents. They would nurture these talents together, studying, supporting one another, indulging in the pleasures afforded to them, whether it be prostitutes or each other. And yes, you heard that right. Damn it, the twins and Franco would get along very nicely, I feel. In the 1920s, they would gain a reputation for depravity, later nicknamed the Buffalo Minotaur by the press. Otto and Arora would go on to claim 12 different victims in the Buffalo area alone, with many of the community already viewing them as monsters due to their disfigurement. They seemingly lived up to this reputation in the shadows. The victims of choice for the twins were a mixture of vagrants, prostitutes, and Canadians. Sorry to all my Canadian friends out there, not sure why the twins had it out for you guys, but yeah. Their father would read about them in the newspaper, drinking heavily to cope with what his children truly were. See, even when the twins were toddlers, their father Anton would research surgery and anatomy, looking for a way to separate the twins. This would all come to a head in 1924, after Anton read about what his 25-year-old children's misdeeds were in the newspaper. He would then decide to sneak up on Otto and Arora while they slept, injecting Otto with a drug, and begins attempting to separate the twins with a handsaw. It's only due to the quick thinking of Arora, who throws a chemical vial at her father while injecting Otto to reawaken him, leading them to do some pretty messed up stuff to their dear old dad. They would use the handsaw and cut their father in half, viewing it as indulging in their pleasures, since that's what you do when the world views you as unnatural after all. Arora would carefully sew her father back together, but upside down, leaving his arms where his legs should be and his legs where his arms should be, taking careful effort to make sure that he stays alive. They then turn their father into the very thing that he tried to fix of them, keeping him alive for weeks, making him suffer in all types of different ways, including throwing him into the water while they just sat and drank and watched the show. I don't think anyone could surprise me after Franco, but Otto and Arora might just take the cake here, I'll be honest. They would begin taking more control of Kress Chemicals after the unfortunate fate of their father Anton, turning around the financial situation and making breakthrough after breakthrough that would garner Kress Chemical the nickname of the Wizards of the Northeast. It was during 1948 that Congress passed a Federal Water Pollution Control Act, not particularly something that helps a chemical company, let's say. Otto would put his political brain to work, empowering other politicians and manipulating the water pollution regulations from the shadows. It's during this same period of time, during the 1940s, where the Buffalo Minotaur begins claiming more victims than is even known about, splitting up their time between being a political puppeteer by day and a bloodthirsty serial killer by night. The consequences of these actions would, however, catch up on the twins in 1958, after they were arrested at their home, being found covered in blood after one of their many murders. Murkoff already had a business partnership with Kress Chemical by this stage, and the Buffalo Minotaur, in particular, caught the interest of Clyde Perry. After reading about their exploits, Clyde felt that whoever the serial killer was could be invaluable to the lathe program at Sinala facility. Hearing about the arrest of the Buffalo Minotaur, Clyde Perry acquired Otto and Arora from their police holding cell, being placed into the Chemical Research and Development Division of Murkoff Corporation. Now, some context on how Murkoff manages to get these two off of a murder case. See, families as rich as the Kresses are very rarely guilty, and Kress Chemical was such a huge company that employed thousands of different people, and if news came out that Otto and Arora, the two heads of Kress Chemical, were actually the Buffalo Minotaur, it would completely destroy the whole chemical supply chain and put thousands of people out of jobs. So instead, they pinned the murders on the Kress estate groundskeeper that worked for the family. Murkoff would reach out to Clyde Tolson, an FBI agent that spoke with J. Edgar Hoover and made a deal. Murkoff would cover up the mess in exchange for Otto and Arora to be used in their R&D department. They would work closely with Dr. Jun Kusumura, a scientist from Japan that worked with the Axis forces during World War II, but he would later become a CIA asset under Project Paperclip. It's even stated that Arora taught herself Japanese while working in R&D of Murkoff, just so she could speak fluently with Kusumura about chemical science. Shortly after the death of Clyde Perry, Dr. Kusumura would actually speak to Otto and Arora, showing them pictures of Clyde Perry's body, mentioning how he was split in half. Now, they don't have any love for Clyde, stating that the only thing that they wished was that he would suffer no more than the furthest possible limits a man can endure while staying conscious, and are actually disgusted by the manner of his death, with Otto saying, "What God has joined together, let no man rend asunder." The two of them begin reminiscing about their father as Arora begins crying. Kusumura points this out, with Arora stating that she only has sweet memories of her father. Otto tells Arora to ask Kusumura about the other thing that he wanted to discuss, when Kusumura quickly covers his mouth as the chemical cloud fills the room. Otto attempts to run at the doctor, but falls unconscious before he has the opportunity to get to him. Kusumura tells him that it's a big surprise and they'll just have to wait and see what it is when they awake, moving Otto and Arora into the prime asset role within the Lathe program. This was a choice made between Avalanos, Easterman, and Scarfiotti, with Avalanos pointing out that they had told the CIA that they would create politicians, thought leaders, and nobody fits the bill better than Otto and Arora. They would be the perfect candidate. This is of course where you encounter Otto and Arora within the shopping mall program. Things only get even creepier as we now get on to our next official prime asset, Sister Liliya Bogomolova. In 1939, a young girl, nicknamed in a news article about the incident as the Feral Girl, was found by authorities. She was found within a homemade prison cell, nearby a dead woman that is presumed by authorities to be her mother. But unfortunately, since this feral girl only communicates using animal-like grunts, they are not able to actually verify this with her. The Sisters of St. Gaspar's Orphanage would take on the responsibility of caring for the 11-year-old girl, while authorities attempt to find out the whereabouts of any of her surviving family and find any other people that might be responsible for her shameful state. Unfortunately, she would not adapt well to her new home, with the sisters describing how the young girl would regularly disrupt the going-ons at the orphanage. Authorities believe this behavior could point towards a history of abuse, as if finding her in a homemade prison cell wasn't enough proof of that. Liliya was the only child of exiled landowners who had to flee their motherland in the revolution, spending the first 10 years of her life within a box, a homemade prison, never once seeing sunlight, never seeing her mother's face or even hearing her mother's voice. She would be breastfed blindfolded, in complete silence. The first human face that she ever saw, or the first human voice that she ever heard, was the police that found her within her cell that day at 11 years old. She would spend her teenage years at the Parisian Catholic orphanage, within earshot of the bells of Notre Dame in Paris, struggling to fit in well at the orphanage, being shunned by the other girls there. She was emaciated and strange, acting like she had never eaten solid food before, instead opting to attempt to breastfeed by one of the nuns. This obviously didn't go down well, but I know damn well that Franco would be a very big fan of Liliya with the addition of that little detail. It turns out that she was absolutely obsessed with the Bible, saying that she learned how to speak because God himself was the one talking to her. Once able to speak, the other girls at the orphanage began to warm up to her, with most of them believing her to be actually overwhelmingly charismatic. With Liliya now believing that God is speaking to her, he would tell her that she is the Russian Joan of Arc, and her sacred mission is to walk to St. Petersburg and liberate it from the Hun. It wasn't long before she left the orphanage on foot for St. Petersburg, Russia. Now this is where things get really quite interesting. It's not long after this that World War II was happening. Stories began in Russia about somebody called the Angel of Leningrad, or the Russian Joan of Arc. She would become a legend amongst Russian forces, calling her Bogomolova, the same name God told her to call herself years before. For context, Bogomolova means beloved of God in Russian. She would survive for 3 years in the most brutal warfare possible, becoming a Bogomol, the Russian term for a praying mantis, an ambush predator. Disappearing into the shadows, hiding among statues, among corpses of the frozen dead. She believed that she was protected by God and killed countless German soldiers during the siege of Leningrad. The Germans were terrified of her, while also being oddly fascinated. Eventually Germany had to retreat from Stalingrad, and God's protection on Liliya was now over. A Nazi officer, retreating from Stalingrad, went on to capture Liliya, chopping off her right hand as punishment for cutting his face while he tried to restrain her. She would curse the officer, and in return he would cut out her tongue. There was no telling what happened to Liliya while the Germans took her on the rat line to the Mediterranean. But once in Genoa, with no tongue, she began to pray, and the night before being put on a boat to Argentina, a miracle happened. Her tongue grew back, and she could now speak once more. But not only that, after listening to God's voice, she could now speak in God's own tongue, using this new language to give the German officers in charge of her some ideas. After influencing them to fight each other and kill each other, she would head into the forests of Eastern Europe, lost for years. But villagers and travellers would find corpses in these forests, transformed into religious statuaries. Years later, oddities continued happening. Rich folk, wealthy families, and industrialists that were funded with American dollars to rebuild Europe post-war were all of a sudden spending all of their money with no real reason or cause, and suddenly, just like that, they would vanish from society. Later, these bodies would turn up, usually in pieces with different body parts missing. These odd behaviours of the rich, as well as their similar deaths, would garner the interest of the CIA. They would go on to appoint an agent named George Nichols to investigate the deaths, and more importantly, the link that this may have with some missing funds from the Mutual Security Act, which had been missing, and the CIA have been unable to find where these funds could have gone. The Mutual Security Act, for anyone curious, was a real US foreign aid law that was brought in by President Truman in 1951, with the aim of giving economic assistance to free nations and allies to build infrastructure and defences, overall helping strengthen themselves against the Soviets and containing communism as a whole. Tens of millions of dollars are missing, and Agent Nichols suspected a person named Liliya Bogomolova could be responsible. Dawes would tell Nichols that his theory warrants further investigation and provides him the resources to do so. He would go on investigating into the ruined estates of these wealthy families and garner more details of this Angel of Leningrad, or Sister Liliya, from people, putting together a comprehensive background that I just mentioned. He would connect the dots between the feral girl from years earlier described in the news article and this Liliya Bogomolova of legends. They were one and the same. One of these wealthy people that went missing was a millionaire, Jackie Trugoat, a person of interest that Agent Nichols wanted to focus on. We can actually see an article about his death in the newspaper, showing that the shipping magnate's death was due to asphyxiation rather than blood loss from all the missing limbs and such. It was ruled that Jackie must have done this to himself, but Nichols wanted to dig a little deeper. He would speak to the Trugoat family valet, before mentioning how he was half of a man, completely mutilated, even among survivors of landmines. He was missing his left foot, he only had 2 fingers remaining on his left hand, he had 1 eye, pretty rough stuff. He spoke about Liliya as if he was reciting gospel. He clearly considered her like a saint. He mentioned how Liliya had become Jackie Trugoat's spiritual guide, helping him sacrifice the evils of money and cut away the evils of the flesh. It was here that it clicked for Agent Nichols. Trugoat wasn't embezzling the MSA funds that were missing. He was literally destroying his money, in between the removal of his own fingers, eyes and limbs. Imagine it like a Build-A-Bear, but in reverse. Nichols would ask the valet why Jackie would do such a thing, with the valet telling him that it was simply because Liliya asked him to do it. The valet's own injuries were also because Liliya told him to do it. Nichols described the valet as being almost in love, or possibly inspired by Liliya, someone who had seen God with his own 2 eyes, or I guess 1 eye now. In one of Agent Nichols' journal entries, he mentions feeling dizzy and having a fever. wondering if he had caught something, struggling to keep his thoughts straight. The valet told him that Liliya is now with one of the Dragoa children in a lodge within the mountains. Nichols would head out to the location and actually find Liliya Bogomolova in the process, described as a religious parasite, exploiting the spiritual vacuum in the hearts of the wealthy elite, turning their hunger for conquest against their own bodies. Liliya would talk to Agent Nichols, telling him that she would allow him to bring her in, as long as he gives her gifts. What are these gifts, you may ask? Well, it's to cut away at his own sins, under her direction. The same direction of God. In 1953, Agent Nichols, now missing an arm, leg and an eye, would take Liliya to Mount Massive Asylum, where he would meet and speak with Dr. Vernick. At first, Vernick believes Nichols of being a survivor of landmines or artillery due to his injuries, since he did actually serve for the Americans in the World War. Nichols would describe this story to Vernick, fascinating him since he had heard his own stories about the Angel of Leningrad during his time when he was serving the Nazis and hearing it from the German officers. Agent Nichols believed that Sister Liliya witnessed something in the siege of Leningrad, in the wilderness consecrated by the blood of entire nations. Dr. Vernick believes him to almost be obsessed with Liliya. Liliya being brought to Mount Massive doesn't seem like a random piece of luck. Vernick believes that Liliya wants to be brought to Mount Massive just as much as the CIA want her to be here. He thinks it could be due to the wealth and corruption of America as too much of a temptation for her to resist. Years later in 1960, Silas Knisley returns to Mount Massive Asylum, where he's currently working in the Human Resources and Corrections Department. He requests the medical reports for a patient within the asylum for a patient transferred to the Sinyala facility. Liliya Bogomolova marked in her files as critical security and would require the direct permission of a Dr. Vernick if she was to be transferred. Silas would waste no time and arrange a meeting with Rudolf Vernick. Within her medical files, it stated that Liliya has now been catatonic for about roughly 5 years, and eating up a considerable amount of the budget for security and sedative reasons. He had negotiated with Dr. Easterman the transfer of Sister Liliya Bogomolova to the Sinyala facility, something that he considers a great deal. It's like selling a dead dog for the price of a prized horse. Vernick explains the story of Liliya to Silas, and shows him just how dangerous she really is. Wherever Liliya goes, she creates acolytes, all mutilated, missing tongues, arms, eyes, and legs. Half of these new patients at Mount Massive, by the way, these acolytes of Sister Liliya, were once staff members, doctors, administrators of Mount Massive. In just the first 6 months of her stay at Mount Massive Asylum, they lost 20% of their budget to her influence. A complete pure waste of funds. They would then go on to lose 10% of their staff to her manipulation, or she would simply kill the ones that she couldn't manipulate with blades she somehow kept hiding inside of her gowns. Vernick considers her far too dangerous and, more importantly, expensive to keep, but far too interesting to kill. With the only choice to keep her sedated to the gills for their own survival, Vernick laughs at the chance to be rid of her to Sinyala, deathly curious of the scientific results of what she could do there, but reminds Silas that they aren't sending them a dead frog, but instead, they're sending them a viper. And with that, we have now covered all of the worst individuals that Murkoff could throw at these poor reagents at Sinyala. Comment down below your favourite prime assets so far. And if you have any ideas of what you think would be a cool concept for the next prime asset, I'd be interested to see what you guys think. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to like as it helps out a lot. And of course subscribe for more Outlast and game lore videos in the future. Until next time guys, peace.